So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and all. My name's Allen Hilton, and those of you who have been here before and haven't seen me yet ever may be wondering what I'm doing here. I'm a friend of this congregation and kind of a big fan of this congregation, and especially of these two and Erica. And so when it came time to have a conversation about something hard to talk about, they said, well, what if we have Allen come over? Because that's the kind of thing I help people with. And so I'm honored to get to be here, but my role tonight is to set the table for them to have a great conversation. Tonight's topic, as you know, because you're here, is abortion, which I know you all have an easy time talking about it, but there are some people who don't. And actually, these two may just be a little nervous. Can you relate to that? Yeah. And so what we're going to build tonight as we have this conversation, in a setting of American vehemence, in which last week a pro-choicer was arrested outside Justice Kavanaugh's house with a gun, right? And in which we've seen abortion clinics bombed, in which the American resort to violence happens around this issue. But even short of that, it's just one of those issues that we avoid one another about. We have strong convictions, but we don't really trust ourselves to talk with one another about it. So what you've got tonight is just a wondrous possibility of listening to two people who love one another, Tracy and Jordan, two people who love one another, who are going to talk about this awfully hard thing to talk about, and they disagree about it, right? And so we're going to get to be the living room viewers. They're going to have a conversation. I'm just here to start the ball rolling. They're going to have a conversation, and you and I get to listen in. And so as we build that space, it's going to be brave, because it's a courageous thing even to take up in the beginning, right? But we'd also like it to be a grace space. Because as you know, you can step wrong with one word and worry that everybody's going to hate you in this current climate. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to hearts as they talk. And if they say something that nettles you, or if they say something that you don't agree with, we're going to give space for grace to listen further, all right? So a brave space and a grace space. That's what we're trying to build. Now, the other thing about this issue is it's not just a debate issue. It's a personal issue, right? This is an issue in which we all have a story or know somebody who has a story. It's a personal issue in which high emotion is present, and some pain and memories for some people. So we're in dainty space. Right? We're in gentle space, where we're going to just know that we're touching things that are difficult and close. So we're just going to be gracious, all right? So the format is easy. I'm just going to start by asking Tracy a question, and then we're going to roll forward from there, and then I'll ask Jordan a question, and pretty soon they'll be just asking one another some questions, ones that you would probably want to ask, right? So again, think of yourself as the people who are awkwardly sitting on the other side of a glass listening to the living room conversation. And I'm going to open us in prayer. So let's pray. Our God, you are gracious. And so make grace happen here, we pray. You are loving, so make love happen here. And you built courage, so help courage happen here. Be the tender of hearts and minds, and be present with us, we pray. In Jesus, amen. Before I ask the first question, there is one thing that I need to ask of you, and that is no applause. And here's why. This is not a debate. These two are not trying to persuade one another. We think this is an issue fraught with conviction, and rightly so, right? This is an issue on which people have strong convictions, and it's an important issue. It's not like we're debating what color the carpet is going to be in the sanctuary, right? This is an important issue. But tonight is not about persuasion. Tonight is about understanding. So the questions you hear will be curious questions. And that's what we hope, the mood we hope it will spark in the room. All right? So no applause if you hear what you like. No booing if you hear what you don't like. Just kind of listen in and see if you can understand more about these two and maybe more about yourself because of it. All right? Tracy, why in the world, right? Everybody is on abortion right now. Since the leak of the Supreme Court's opinion, at least in draft form, and awaiting the Supreme Court's final announcement of its decision, everybody's talking about this, and we could have brought in experts who know the history of debate about Roe v. Wade, and we could have brought in experts who know prior history to that. So why are we talking tonight?
So I drew the short straw, and I'm going first. But what happened was when the Supreme Court decision was leaked, or a draft of it, we were talking about it at our clergy meeting because we knew it was going to have a huge impact on our ministry. And Jordan and I recognized that, to our surprise, we had very different opinions on this issue. And Erica was kind of sitting back just listening to us have this conversation. And she said, this is an important conversation. These are important things that you're saying, and we shouldn't keep this private. So yes, we could have brought in amazing people that are far more articulate and scholarly on this issue, but we are your pastors, and we love you, and we love each other, and we are both moms. We have both suffered pregnancy loss. We have both thought and prayed about this issue a lot. So we thought, let's have this conversation and make it available to a wider audience, perhaps.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the things that we talked about was that so much of the conversation, when people hear Christian, or they hear Christian leaders, or the Christian view, they immediately think one thing. But having us as Christian leaders disagree and have a loving conversation is just an important thing to model.
Mm-hmm. Well, we greatly appreciate your willingness to do that. And I know that, little secret, at the outset, you two both didn't immediately say, well, of course, Erica, right? This is not something you raise your hand quickly to volunteer for. So your courage is well noted by us. And we're grateful that you're willing to do that, willing to let us in on your conversation. And Jordan, can you talk a little bit about the place from which you two entered this, who you are, and how that might impact point of view or subjectivity?
Yeah. So like the practice in feminist studies is that before you launch into an article or whatever, you have to position yourself to let the audience know who you are and where you're coming from. And so, Tracy and I are both white, cisgender, married, heterosexual women who have master's degrees, have full-time jobs. I mean, there's a lot about our experiences that are very, very similar, and it impacts how we view this topic of abortion. We recognize that we do not have what is called epistemic privilege of people who are affected by abortion. So we do not know what it feels like to be BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. We do not know what it feels like to be a single parent. There's a lot of things that we come without. One thing that is important about how we position ourselves is we are committed to living out Micah 6:8, right? In everything we do, we are committed to doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. So in this moment, that is sort of the background. Another thing is a note on language. So language is powerful. There are going to be moments where Tracy and I sort of interchangeably use words like baby, fetus, embryo, just have grace with us. Those are emotionally charged words, but we might just say one of them and maybe not mean what you think we mean, so just be gracious. Also, we are probably going to say women or women's rights, but we also recognize that trans and non-binary folks can also be pregnant. So like we recognize that, so if we're saying women's, we're also going to try to say reproductive rights or reproductive justice.
It's hard, isn't it? It's hard because we're vigilant about words, we ought to be, but it's hard to be fully caught up with language you might want to use when you're just in front of people talking. So we will give you grace, okay? We will give you grace. And that leads to my next question. And this is kind of for both of you, so just bounce around. What makes you most anxious, or what part of this conversation worries you the most as we sit down, as we get started here? What are you worried about?
I am concerned about being hurtful unintentionally. I really do. I wouldn't want for anything that I say tonight to make anyone rethink a decision that they made at some point in their life. Every one of us made the right decision at the time based on the information we had. So my fear is being hurtful unintentionally, and also my fear is having people perceive me as a less accessible pastor because they may be dealing with a pregnancy and have questions about that pregnancy and maybe not know if I'm the right person to come to. So those are just some things that I struggled with as I thought about participating tonight.
Yeah.
How about you, Jordan?
I am concerned about triggering someone. We are going to be talking about some heavy things, even in addition to abortion. We're going to be talking about rape. We're going to be talking about miscarriage. So we don't want to cause harm. So we just want to have that trigger warning, content warning now. We also want to acknowledge that obviously the point of this is that we don't totally speak for the sides that we represent tonight. So just remembering that we are just one person. And really, I'm nervous because we are probably going to say something wrong. And it'll probably be very apparent as soon as it comes out of our mouth.
Don't worry, it'll be on video.
It'll be recorded. But just, I'm very nervous about saying something and regretting it later, but we're just gonna let the Holy Spirit lead us tonight.
Yeah, and one of the things, so the questions that I've started with are more about talking, right? How do you feel about the talking, and how do you feel about talking about this? We're going to get into in a second, we're going to get into the actual issues around abortion and how you both, what your convictions are. And it occurs to me that neither of you, and you kind of spoke this a little bit, Tracy, neither of you actually fits a stereotype of the position you're going to kind of express to us. And so one of the things that I am concerned about as we start is just that people listen long enough to realize, wait, you don't know me yet, right? You don't quite get me yet if you just think because I said this thing, I mean a lot of other things, right? So one of the great things for you all to do is just to keep listening, right? I heard an interview once with an actress who had taken a bunch of different kinds of parts in movies early in her career. And the interviewer asked her, is this purposeful? And she said, yes. You know the kind of person when you know they're a vegetarian, you know everything else about them? She says, you really don't, right? So I play a lot of parts, and these two play a lot of parts, and their way of being in the world is not reducible to one side or other of a binary issue. So I'll start with you, Tracy. How would you describe your position on abortion, and kind of help us out with how you think you got there? What brought you to that position as you have it now?
Sure. So most of my adult life, I identified as pro-choice. And at this point in my life, I believe that life begins at implantation, when, if not acted upon by an outside force, the cells will grow into a baby, God willing. And I know that's kind of a unique pro-life position, and it's, you know, when we talk about how I came to that position, there were really 3 instances in particular. The first was when I was working at as a chaplain in a hospital, and I had the privilege of baptizing a fetus that was part of a perinatal loss at 18 weeks gestation. And I held the fetus in my hand and did that sacred act. The second was working with a family in a hospital as a chaplain again, who was in a position of terminating their pregnancy at 23 weeks. And in that circumstance, I ended up being asked to do footprints of the baby that the parents wanted for a keepsake. So I interacted with the baby after the abortion, which was very life-changing for me, frankly. And then the third instance was experiencing my own perinatal loss right around 8 weeks gestation. And I did grieve not only the loss of what I imagined my life being once this baby came into the world, but I also felt a sense of loss of that embryo. I felt, or a fetus, right around 8 weeks, I felt a connection to that fetus, and I grieved its loss. And those 3 circumstances kind of conspired to make me think of kind of 2 things. I overthink a lot of things, so here we go. You're gonna get a little snapshot of that today. The first is this idea of wantedness. And this is a very controversial idea, using terminology wanted pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy, or planned pregnancy or unplanned pregnancy. But let me say this. The idea of wantedness, because it's complicated because there are pregnancies that are wanted that still end in abortion. So again, a tricky term. But I find it upsetting that there are times when we kind of place value on something based on its wantedness. And there are children in this world who are arguably unwanted by their parents. Some of them may be in foster care, and I don't think that they're any less worthy of living. So this idea of wantedness is something I've really been mulling over in my mind. And the other idea is something that I was introduced to just a few years ago, but this idea of violence. And I really do believe that I want to protect people from violence at any stage of their life, perhaps especially when they're most vulnerable and least able to advocate for themselves. We're still a little unclear about when fetuses can feel pain. There's still a lot we don't exactly know. So the idea of violence is something that's also been affecting my perspective on this issue.
Thank you. Do you have questions, Jordan, or anything you'd like clarified? Or?
I do. I do. I've got lots of them. Yeah. But my follow-up question, or for like clarification, would be, okay, so like contraception, Plan B, the morning after pill, like how do you feel about that with your pro-life stance?
Yeah, so this is a unique position that I have in terms of the implantation idea. But my thought is, as soon as the cells are in a position with which no external interference will impact their ability to grow, then there's life. When I think of cells in a petri dish, say related to stem cell research, there's no chance of that growing into a baby. So, or when I think of the IUD or Plan B, I'm comfortable with birth control and with those sorts of interventions because of that reason. And I can't even say for sure that life begins at implantation, but I'm not exactly sure when at or after implantation life begins. So I kind of just decided to be cautious about it and say, well, at implantation or sometime thereafter. Does that make any sense?
So it kind of makes sure, right?
Yeah.
There's a piece for you, it sounds like, about making sure there's not violation or not ending something that had started.
Yes.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, thank you.
Do you have any other questions for her now? I mean, we'll get to times when you can ask others.
Are you ready?
Go for it.
One?
I love Jordan. There's nothing she can say that'll make me mad.
So, like the trigger warning that was given before, like what about when somebody is raped?
Mm-hmm. Rape, sexual assault is an act of violence. And I am inclined to think that abortion could potentially also be an act of violence. So I feel like it's compounding violence that has already happened. So in a way, instead of there being one victim, there's two victims, or instead of there being one survivor, there's two people affected by that. So I will say, this is a hard thing for me to say. It's a very unpopular position. I appreciate that. And there are so many things we can do as a country to support women better, to help prevent sexual assault, to help respond more appropriately when it does happen in a timely way, respond in a timely way when it does happen. We have a lot of culture that needs to be changed, but philosophically speaking, that's how I feel about it.
Does that come back to you? And we're going to go now to you, sort of stating your place, your convictions, and then Tracy will get to ask you questions.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
So Jordan, what's your position on abortion?
So I am pro-choice because of my faith, not in spite of it. I don't believe that you need a heartbreaking, gut-wrenching story to deserve the option of abortion. I believe that pregnant people deserve respect and dignity to make their own decisions about their bodies. The decision is between the pregnant person, their doctor, their support people. In fact, it's so interesting to me that the whole privacy idea is that it's between the pregnant person and their doctor. And absolutely, but sitting here as a pastor, I would actually say it is between the pregnant person, a doctor, and support people. Mm-hmm. I would wish that more people would have support when it comes to making those decisions. I do not believe that life begins at conception. That is not when I believe life begins, or personhood. I believe there's a possibility. I believe there's a hope that a life would happen. But I don't believe it is a baby until it can exist on its own. So for me, that would be viability, right? So when a fetus could exist outside of a pregnant person's body without any sort of, I say help, but really when I was pregnant with my 2 kids, they kept saying viability is 24 weeks. So in my mind, I'm thinking 24 weeks. But I also recognize that with medical technology, right, that could happen sooner and sooner and earlier and earlier. I don't know. So viability, I believe before that, a person should be able to elect to have an abortion for whatever reason they decide. After that, I believe that it is something that would need to be a medical decision. There would need to be a reason that this is either harming the pregnant person's body or their mental health. And so it's interesting because for me, so I grew up as a pastor's kid in the Midwest. So growing up in Ohio, between my house and my high school, there was a Planned Parenthood. And I would drive by it every single day. And there were always protesters outside, every single time I drove by. And then when I was 18, I went to that Planned Parenthood to get birth control. My parents are watching this right now. Hi, Mom and Dad. Went to Planned Parenthood because I didn't want my parents finding out. And when I got there, I felt this terror as I drove past the protesters. And in that moment, I was just so overwhelmed by what people were experiencing when they drove into that Planned Parenthood, and it just made me start really thinking about what pro-life meant, what pro-choice meant. So that was a huge moment for me. So my own struggle with infertility has also really made me pro-choice. Every time I've experienced that moment where a doctor or a nurse will say, this pregnancy is not viable, I start thinking about what all my options are, a DNC, or whatever that is going to be, and I would just hate for there to not be all of those options. The stigma that surrounds abortion is really upsetting to me. One of my miscarriage, it wasn't getting paid for, and I had pretty good insurance, and I was fighting with the insurance company and finally got a phone call, and they said, I'm so sorry, we don't cover abortions. And I sat there, already traumatized by having a miscarriage. Anybody who's had a miscarriage will know that the medical term is missed abortion or spontaneous abortion. And so this insurance person who was the one coding and was assuming abortion meant that it was an elective thing I did. And the judgment and the stigma that I felt in that moment just made me so passionate about fighting against that stigma. I will also say, being a part of the United Church of Christ, I am so proud to be a part of the United Church of Christ, and as a denomination since 1971, have supported bodily autonomy of women or pregnant people to make the best decisions for themselves. It being Pride, we've talked about gender is something that you get to decide for yourself. Nobody knows you better than you. I feel the same way about that decision to have an abortion or not. The last thing I will say is, so I am a parent, and I had to work hard to become a parent. Being a parent is hard. It is hard, and I think some of what you were saying with the wantedness or unwantedness, I assure you, if I didn't really want my kids, especially during this pandemic, my mental health would have really suffered. I mean, this is very, very real, that these are children that I prayed for and worked for, and I just can't imagine forcing somebody to be a parent if they didn't really want that.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. And thank both of you for sharing personally and vulnerably, and not staying in the sort of propositional layer. Tracy, do you have any questions for Jordan?
Well, you can see now why my appreciation for Jordan deepens every time I talk to her about this issue, because you're brilliant and so kind and amazing. I'm curious about the idea of a soul, and at what point does one have one?
Yes, that is a great question. And it's a question that we all, wonder.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to it. I'm asking her.
Yeah, goodness. And it's sort of a question on both ends of life, right? We wonder when does somebody have a soul, or when does the soul leave the body, when somebody dies. And I'm going to tell you, I'm a Christian pastor that tends to look at other religions to see what truth there is to glean and what there is to find. And I will say, I had a friend in seminary who was Muslim and was preparing to become a Muslim chaplain. And one of the things that they talked about was in traditional Muslim religion, they actually have something called ensoulment. Like there's a moment of ensoulment, and it's 120 days after conception. And there's something about like just sort of having that I think is so interesting. And if you're like calculating like very quickly, that's like 5 months, so 22 weeks, right? Which is fairly close to like that viability idea I was talking about. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's interesting to also look outside of what our Christian like beliefs are and look to other religions. So that's my answer.
Do you have others?
No.
No. Just the soul. All I want to know is the soul. I do want to not only thank you again for sharing your experiences, but notice that, so Jordan introduced us to your position, right? Your beginning point, which impacts the way you think about this issue, right? Your experiences that you share, both of you named moments and life experiences that moved you toward what you believe, right? Which is an important sort of realization, I think, for all of us. We're a bundle of experiences in this place, right? And we sometimes underestimate, I think, the role of those experiences in making us different in the way that we see the world. And so that's really helpful that you are raising up those, not crisis moments, but moments in life that led to where you are now. And they're uniquely yours, right? So having gone to experience, now we're going to go all theological and stuff. So the Bible kind of moves in two different directions about this, right? You've got Jeremiah saying, God called me from my mother's womb. And you've got Torah law, case law in the Torah, in which if a woman's pregnancy is ended and there's no harm to the woman, it's a small penalty. If a woman's pregnancy is ended because these two men are bustling about and accidentally do this, and there is harm to the woman, then it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So on the one hand, you've got Jeremiah saying, God was already at work in me when I was in the belly. And on the other hand, you've got some sort of privileging of the mother and not the fetus in a way, right? Or over the fetus. So that's my way of opening. What is Bible? What does theology? You mentioned some Islamic principles that enter for you, Jordan, but where do you all get resources in your faith that kind of background or participate in what you believe?
Why don't you go first?
Great, I'll go first. So here's what I'm going to say. Again, speaking as a Christian pastor, the Bible is a tool. The Bible can be used to villainize, it can be used to support, it can be very dangerous if we use it in incorrect ways. And so I get very nervous about like, what does the Bible say? Like, I feel like that's not even actually a very good question. And like the reason I say that is because like the context of the Bible is already a patriarchal thing. Women were property, right? The Bible was written by men. Anything it has to say about like women and their bodies and pregnancy is like already suspect to me. So that's like very important. And I also will say I don't like the term biblical values. That's like a very like touchy phrase for me. Because I think the Bible actually has a lot of terrible things to say. So, what I will say...
Could you repeat that last thing?
I think the Bible actually has a lot of really terrible things to say. And so for me, again, as a Christian pastor, I feel like my job, and like our job, is actually to look at how Jesus interprets Scripture. And what Jesus has to say. And one thing I know for sure is that Jesus constantly trusted women. Like, that's actually, like, something I can point to. So, like Alan said before, if you type in, like, what does the Bible say about abortion? Like, literally the first thing that comes up is you shall not murder. And I'm like, okay, so we're already making a bunch of assumptions. So it's really difficult. So I will say the whole idea of viability, again, that I mentioned before, for me, that actually comes from an understanding of a literal reading of Genesis where Adam becomes a person when God breathes into him, that breath is the thing that makes you a person. So that, to me, like, is pretty helpful when I'm thinking about when somebody becomes a person. I will also say in seminary, sometimes we read some really cool things, and sometimes we read some really boring things. And one of the most boring things I had to read in seminary was anything from, like, St. Augustine and St. Aquinas and all of the church fathers. I will say, though, for all of that history, the understanding of when a life began was when the child took its first breath. Like, that was, for the longest time, the moment that somebody becomes a person. My faith leads me to believe that our bodies are temples. Like, our bodies are holy vessels. And I believe that we have the freedom to decide what is in our temples, like what's in our vessels. So that, like, leads me also to be pro-choice. And I do believe that life is precious. Like, this is something Tracy and I, like, talk about, and we do agree. Like, I believe life is so precious, and I will do anything I can. For me, I think the pregnant person's life is precious. And not just, like, their physical body, but, like, their spiritual and mental and emotional selves is precious. And if something is going to impact that or make it more difficult, like, I just don't think it's a very loving thing to push on a holy vessel.
Do you have questions about what Jordan spoke about theological and biblical things?
She had a beautiful answer. I love all her answers.
Yeah.
No, it's a beautiful answer. And as I said to Jordan, one of the most powerful sermons I ever heard, I vividly remember being preached in high school. I was in high school at the time, and my mentor preached a sermon. It was a pro-choice sermon, deeply rooted in Scripture. And from that moment, I realized, frankly, in my opinion, neither side, pro-life, pro-choice, neither owns this issue. It's not like both. You can have positions on either side that have theological and biblical integrity. I come to it kind of differently a little bit in terms of Scripture. So the Scriptures that really speak to me in this issue is the golden rule, like, do unto others. I'm really grateful. My mom and dad might be watching too. I think they're tuning in tonight. I'm grateful that they brought me into the world. I love the children that I created with my husband. I love being here. And I'm just so grateful for them making that happen, even though I'm sure it was difficult for them. The second scripture I love so much is Psalm 139, being knit together in my mother's womb. And to me, that just speaks so much of the purposefulness of the creating activity that happens in the womb. It's so miraculous and amazing and beautiful. And then Micah, we're both super motivated by justice. We're going to talk about justice a little bit more tonight. But this idea, again, of the Lord requires us to do justice. And I think there are a lot of issues related to justice that I'll talk about in a few minutes that relate to this issue.
Yeah, let's let that be the arc toward the question about justice, because because you brought it up here and you brought it up earlier, Jordan. So both of you traffic in Micah 6:8, right? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with our God. But you come down in different places about what that justice, how that justice manifests itself, right? Talk to me about that. So from a justice perspective, Tracy, how does your position on abortion juke with your understanding of what justice is?
So I believe that like our unconditional support of anything, whether it be abortion or any issue, does invite injustice to flourish. And the three kind of areas of justice that I feel really specifically about the issue of abortion. The first is this idea of violence. And again, I'm still really working on this. And I am not saying, oh, if you have an abortion, then you have committed an act of violence. I am not saying that. But there's enough ambiguity and curiosity for me to say, I'm not sure that it's not. So that's one. The second issue for me is this idea of ableism. And I know in the US, 70% of pregnancies where Down syndrome is suspected are terminated through abortion. In Europe, it's closer to 90%. To me, that's very concerning that we are going to place a value on a life based on its potential ability. And there's a lot of questions in terms of one's potential ability when those diagnoses are made early in the pregnancy. I feel like it's bordering on eugenics of saying who deserves to be a part of our society and who doesn't. So it's a little much, but I think you get where I'm going there.
Well, it goes with wantedness, right?
Yes.
But you're talking about it differently here, right? About it as classifying who is worthy of life.
Yes.
Yeah.
And prenatal testing is getting more sophisticated every day.
Yeah.
And so when we can determine, oh, this fetus or this embryo may have autism, like where are we going to draw the line? What kind of society do we want to be where we're deciding which lives are worthy and which ones are less worthy? So that's upsetting to me. And the third issue relates to race. And again, as a white woman, I totally have no entitlement to talk about this whatsoever, but this issue does disproportionately affect people of color. And what I found interesting is recently there was some legislation in Connecticut. 10 of the 14 Democrats that voted against this legislation related to abortion were part of the Black and Puerto Rican caucus. And I want to learn more why they voted against it. So I feel like sometimes as well-meaning white people were like, oh, communities of color need abortion. Maybe that's not what they need. So I'm curious to learn more, and I feel like there's a lot of room for growth for me to learn more about that issue specifically and how it is affecting communities of color.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying about this sort of almost paternalistic decision by people about what would be good for other people, right? Yes. And yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, Tracy. Justice, as you, because I mean that's a big deal. It's a big deal to unpack what justice is. If you're a person of faith, and justice doesn't weave its way over, right? In some kind of articulated way, you may be not quite getting home. How about you, Jordan? Where do you locate justice within your position or your position within questions of justice?
Yeah, so as I said before, this issue of bodily autonomy, right? So to me, that is a justice issue, that nobody should be able to force you to do anything with your body. I also, and I say this very seriously, but also with a little eye roll. Rich, white senators or people in power are always going to have access to abortions. I believe that with my whole heart. Overturning something like Roe v. Wade is actually just going to make it more difficult for the rest of us to access safe abortions. People have always been having abortions. they will continue to have abortions. Like, the justice issue for me is that, like, how can we make things safer for people? It's interesting because I love what you point out about this like recent legislation in Connecticut and like really paying attention to like who voted for and who voted against, like when we don't know the whole story, but it's like interesting to see that like 10 out of 14 are like people of color. I mean, like this is like an interesting thing, and like why? Because so much of, you know, again, I don't have the epistemic privilege, but like so much of what systematic racism shows us is that 3 out of 4 people who like self-report why they had abortions say it was financial insecurity or perceived financial hardship. And so like when we look at the numbers of like, oh my gosh, all of these like Black and brown people are having abortions. And no, the correlation to me is actually that we live in a racist society that is not like empowering and the inequality of access to healthcare, contraception, jobs, like all of these things is like a huge justice issue to me. And I read this thing recently, so race and class, right, like intersecting. And I read this thing that says abortion is a class struggle too, because white men in power will say, hey, we're saving babies because we love them, but really that's just virtue signaling, because really they need poor people to have babies, because then they will be in debt and will work, and those babies grow up and become cheap labor. Like, and as I read that, I sat there and I thought, oh my gosh, like this is why this is more complicated than just like, when does life begin? Like there's so much that goes into this. And I just think it's important for us to be asking more questions, especially when it has to do with something that you and I do not have lived experience of.
Yeah, I just want to notice how justice almost is, it's like light goes into a prism and shows up differently. And we could say, well, Jordan's right and Tracy's wrong about what justice looks like in this, or we could say Tracy's right and Jordan's wrong, or we could say maybe having this conversation is helping us know that justice may be a bigger thing than either of them came with, right? Because I don't know if you notice, they're not point-counterpoint on justice. They have different aspects of justice in mind as they unpack the issue of abortion. And it's just a plug for talking more and joining in conversations about this so that we can make headway, right? And I want you to also notice that Roe v. Wade didn't really come up among them until just now. That's pretty good restraint, I would say, right? we aren't going to applaud, but it's pretty good restraint. And now we get to the thing that prompted the conversation in the first place, not just Roe v. Wade, but the idea of public policy and how your positions or the way your convictions about abortion matter for what you think should happen in public policy. You've done a marvelous job of describing your position and how you got to it, and a lot of the implications and a lot of how it interweaves with your faith. A lot of what goes on about abortion outside that realm is public policy. So let's talk about that for a second. And I know this is a place where you're going to have some surprises just from conversations that we've had. So Tracy, you first on public policy. How does this make its way into public policy for you?
Yes. So I do support Roe versus Wade, and I do want to live in a world where abortion is not necessary. I want to, but I do feel like abortion does need to exist until there are many, many other things that we fix. And when I talk about this idea of violence, like, if I feel like there's violence involved in abortion. I also feel like there's violence in telling a woman who's been sexually assaulted that now they have to carry this child to term. So it's almost like a balancing of violence, which is not easy. But as far as Roe versus Wade is concerned, I feel like overturning it tomorrow will create much more violence and loss of life when it comes to women and their bodies. I will also say this is another area where I'm searching and learning. And I say that because we have had abortion legalized now for 50 years, and we still haven't fixed any of those problems that would genuinely give women a choice. And again, I'm sorry about the gender-specific language, but parents a choice about their pregnancy. So right now, if I say to someone, oh, you have a choice, you can get an abortion, or you can bring this child into the world and potentially not finish your education and not get parental leave and maybe lose your job and maybe be discriminated against by your next employer and make less money and be in financial insecurity and not be able to pay for college anymore, or you can have an abortion. I don't think that's a choice. So I don't feel like I'm doing a woman a big favor by giving her a quote-unquote choice in that way. A real choice is fixing all of these other things with early childhood education, with affordable childcare, with good health care, with affordable college, with resources for families with children with disabilities. Far, far more choice would exist than what we present people with today. So I get very excited about that because it's so complicated. But as of this minute, I feel like we're not there yet.
Right. So you, let me see if I get this right. You would like Roe v. Wade to stay, or the right to an abortion to stay, even being a pro-life person.
Yes.
Because of the conditions under which choice is prompted to be made, right?
And ultimately, I'm concerned though, I do ask myself that question, what will give our politicians the political will to actually fix all these things I described? Maybe it will be the mayhem that ensues when Roe versus Wade is overturned at the expense of women. So I can't imagine that happening, and also I can't imagine these other things getting fixed without that happening, so I'm feeling really stuck.
Yeah, thank you. I love this conversation. It's very helpful to me. Jordan, the same question to you. Public policy, what does your set of views put in play in terms of public policy? Is it simply we need to keep Roe v. Wade? What are the other implications of your sense about this?
So, like, even before getting to something like that, like, I believe in, like, freedom of religion, and it is, like, very concerning to me that so much of this is based on a Christian understanding of life. This is not a Christian nation. Like, that is not, like, I think it's not supposed to be.
And I would even say a specific version of Christian identity, yes.
Coerced belief doesn't work. It doesn't work in the church. Coerced belief doesn't work in, communities, in home. Like, it just doesn't work. I believe that's violence, coerced belief. And I don't believe it's a very loving way to be in the world, right? Like, to force your beliefs on other people. It's as if, like, these other people are just, like, these empty things that we just get to, like, put our beliefs into. But no, they're full incarnated beings with their own understandings of things. I, was reading something recently about a group of Islamic imams who are, like, counteracting the, Roe v. Wade thing in whatever way they can, to say, like, no, it actually, like, says in, like, Muslim tradition that there are instances where if you don't allow someone to have an abortion, like, that is not okay. That, like, you have to allow that because of, you know, however it would harm someone. So they're saying it's against their religion to push this on them. And I just, like, any sort of policy, and again, I qualify all of this with, like, I'm a Christian. Like, I'm a Christian pastor. Like, I believe in this. I love this. This is why I do this. And I am pretty suspect of things that are just based on a Christian, like, one type of Christianity. I also, in terms of public policy, I am really, we talked about language before, I'm really uncomfortable with the term, like, late-term abortions as this, like, violent, merciless thing, as if pregnant people just wait until they're like 7, 8, 9 months pregnant and then go, guess I'm gonna have an abortion. Like, that's just not how it works. And so, like, when I think about, like, the policies that are made, like, you can't have an abortion after, you know, 20 weeks or whatever. These, like, sort of, I'm gonna say arbitrary times, because anybody who's ever been pregnant, you normally don't get to have, like, an anatomy scan until about 20 weeks. And if you find out something, like, it just seems like such an arbitrary line to draw in the sand, and so I'm really uncomfortable with that, especially because anybody who's having a late-term abortion, and we've talked about this, Tracy and I have talked about this, as, like, a pastoral care concern. People who are having to make that decision, like, they've already picked out a name, you know? Like, they've painted the nursery. Like, they may already have the car seat, like, installed in the car. I mean, like, it's just the idea that, like, not allowing someone to make a decision to, like, lessen the harm. Like, if you find out that, like, your baby has already died or is going to die shortly after birth, like, I actually think it is unloving and violent to make them carry that baby to term, actually. So, like, in regard to public policy, like, that is really, really important to me. The other thing, this is another thing that Tracy and I have talked about. As a survivor of sexual assault, I can tell you, when I hear people say, like, I don't believe in abortion, except for, you know, cases of rape or incest, like, I sit there and I go, oh, like, I know what you're trying to say, but, like, do you know how hard it is already to prove that you were raped? Like, the idea that, like, we just magically will have a justice system where it's, like, super easy to, like, bring somebody to justice, and that's how you get to have an abortion, like, that makes me so uncomfortable. Like, we have these ideas of, like, you know, CSI and you know, SVU and a whole team of people, like, investigating a sexual assault, and, like, that's just not how it works. That is just not how this world works. So it makes me, in regard to public policy, let's just say that's what happens. Let's just say, okay, no abortion, except for rape and incest. It's still never gonna be allowed, because how will you ever prove that? Especially because it's not just, like, being raped by, like, a stranger in the bushes. Like, you can be raped by your husband. Like, these are real things that I don't think, like, we're set up to understand or handle.
Or arbitrate, right?
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah. And what I hear you saying, Jordan, is it's another layer of responsibility placed on, or right, on the person carrying the baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is good. I want to ask a question just to brief answers on this one. What role should public opinion play in this? We hear often, X percentage of Americans believe X about, because the Pew Research Center or Gallup has gathered information. And I bring this up because in your sort of stages of pregnancy conversation regarding justice and public policy, there are gradations in the positions of the public, right? So we've talked about what does Bible have to do with this? What does our experience have to do with? What role should it play, this general kind of, call it common wisdom or common foolishness, whatever public opinion is? What do you all think it should matter?
Well, I'm just gonna say, first off, like, I feel like since I'm a congregational minister, like I should definitely give like an answer that aligns with like congregational like understanding, right? So yes, so like I actually do believe that like some sort of, when we talk about democracy, right, and this like what the people want as being important, and it sort of goes back to the thing we were saying at the beginning about like who gets to be an expert. And this idea of like epistemic privilege. I could read every book in the world I want about being a trans person. I am never going to know what it is like being a trans person. I'm not the expert, even if I'm a scholar on it. So I don't have an answer.
Well, yeah, I won't go further because I don't want to bog things down, but Tracy, any thoughts on that? What should the general popular opinion have to do with how this gets done?
If we went strictly by popular opinion, we might still have segregated schools. So I'm not sure that, the community just necessarily is always looking with an eye toward justice. And so I know our representatives are elected to represent us, and also they're also responsible for determining best public policy. And best public policy is not based on isolated incidents that you read about on social media, which you do.
A lot of people make decisions about it.
These horror stories you hear about abortion, they should be based on data and science and research, not necessarily on majority of public opinion or on these very specific cases taken out of context.
So I'm hearing a little bit from both of you that in different ways you both see the public as not informed enough to be trusted with this decision. Is that, and I'm not trying to pin you down, I'm trying to summarize, right? I'm just trying to summarize, because in your case, Jordan, what I heard was the general public can't know what it is to be non-binary or trans, and the general public, not all of the general public can know what it is to be faced with a pregnancy, right? And so what I heard from you is that's what makes the general public maybe not the best litmus, and what I'm hearing from you is general public gets it wrong and stays behind what ought to happen sometimes, and we can name segregation, we can name sort of other things where if we had gone by general popular opinion, we'd still be doing things that are kind of not so great, right?
I will just say, I actually think that I would be much more willing to listen to what our legislators have to say about this, what we're talking about, if like any of them have ever been pregnant. Like, I'm gonna be totally honest. Like, I would be like much more willing, because actually that's what I'm saying about epistemic privilege. Like, actually, like until you have like that moment to understand like how scary these decisions are, like you just are not necessarily going to know how to make the right decision. I don't know. I guess it's a combination. Is that a cop-out? It's a combination.
No, I appreciate your reflecting on it. And And the sort of next space to go is to the surprises that I mentioned earlier. Because, Tracy, you are pro-life and feminist. Talk to us about that.
All right. So, as Jordan said, about 3/4 of the people who are interviewed, or who in the research, it shows that it's issues of education that they're concerned about, work or ability to care for other dependents, or financial. And so, for me, I feel like women deserve better choices, and it grieves me that our choices don't involve us having access to the resources we need to do what we might be inclined to do if we felt the heart to bring a pregnancy to term. The second thing related to feminism is that also about 2/3 of women report being coerced into ending a pregnancy. So I'm concerned about issues of justice related to that. And then this is a little much, okay, but I want to say it. There is also a financial piece, okay? So ultimately, abortion is an industry. There's money changing hands. And I kind of feel like even like the gun lobby is saying, oh, we're defending your Second Amendment right. Well, they're also making money doing it. So I feel like any time that there's money involved, we need to be a little suspicious. Maybe we need to ask more questions and understand it better. And also, employers benefit from us having abortions too. It's cheaper for them to send you from your place of employment in Texas up to Connecticut to get an abortion than it is for them to give you parental leave, or to tolerate you missing days at work because you have a child at home you need to take care of. So it's even in the employer's best interest for have abortions, and that seems kind of gross to me. And the government, frankly, benefits from us having abortions too, because they don't have to worry about Medicaid or child care or other things. So I feel like there's a lot of agendas that make me, I mean, I'm not a big conspiracy person in general, but I have to ask, if there's this much money involved and it is an industry, who benefits and how and why? And I want to learn more about that also.
So I'm very fascinated. Earlier, Jordan, you made the case that the system wants babies born because they want cheap labor, and you're making the opposite case, that the system wants babies of some people done away with so they don't have to pay for leave, or, right? That's something for the two of you to talk about sometime, because you're both making an economic or a systems argument that is on opposite sides, and both of them are, to me, a little compelling, right? So that's fascinating, but it does give us a sense of why you want both. You want a pro-life future, and you want the cause of women to be primary in American consideration, in human consideration, right? And those fit together in the way you just put it. So you have solved the conundrum of me, right?
I wish it was that easy.
And Jordan, this is sort of, I hate to end that flippantly because this is very personal. As someone who's experienced miscarriage and mourns that loss, how do you reconcile that with your support of abortion, which is a different kind of loss, right? A cousin loss,
Yeah. So, I mean, I do. I mourn the losses that I've experienced. And to me, those are deaths of a certain future, right? Like, from the moment, you see positive sign or the word pregnant, like just everything in the world starts like running through your head. You want to go out and buy clothes. I mean, like, there's all these things about it. And for me, like, miscarriage is a death of that particular future you were thinking about. I do not believe it was an actual death, because I don't believe that was a baby yet. But I still, like, deeply mourn those losses, and actually, like, thinking about the, like, justice and public policy thing, like, while I don't think it is a death, like I still believe that like you should have paid time off after you have a miscarriage. It is a painful and emotional thing. And so here's the thing, like here's how I'm like able to like reconcile that, is that I don't believe that's a life. 1 in 4 women experience miscarriage. And let's be honest, like it's probably more. And so like the statistic is like 15 to 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, but really you ask other people and it's like 30 to 40% because some people don't even know they're pregnant yet. So you could actually have a miscarriage at like 6 to 8 weeks, but really you just thought it was your period. So it's actually like possible that a lot of miscarriages are happening. So that's millions of pregnancies, basically, a year. And that's just like naturally what happens. These aren't people that are doing something wrong, right? Like I know why I had miscarriages. Like I understand that it is because of like my biology. Like I know that. And this is like not totally thought out, but like literally, this is something that I have a hard time with. I believe in a loving God. Okay, like first and foremost, I believe in a loving God. I believe that God created our bodies, and as complex and confusing as they might be, I cannot believe that God, a loving God, would create bodies that would allow millions of actual babies to die. Like I just can't like wrap my head around that. I already have a hard enough time understanding how children die. Like living children out in the world, how people die. Like I can't even wrap my head around that. To think that God created a system where millions of like actual little lives are lost every year. Like to me, that just doesn't feel like a loving God. So like I have a really hard time thinking that those are babies, that God would just let them die.
Yeah. So mostly we have just hoped that these folks would listen in as if we're in a living room and talking to one another, and you guys have done an amazing job about that. But we have known they're out there, right? And so my last question is, what do you most hope that these people and the people who are streaming online will take from this conversation? What would you sort of most commend as an after thing for them to take away?
Want to go first?
Yeah. Don't ever assume that you know somebody's story. Because really, like, I have to be honest, I have totally avoided this conversation with Tracy for a long time. I knew that you were pro-life.
I did have a bumper sticker.
She had a bumper sticker on her car. I mean, I knew this. And it was just sort of, to me, I was like, I'm just not even gonna bring that up, right? Because like my dream in life is to be on like the clergy like advocate board for Planned Parenthood. Like I am like so pro-choice, and I like was just so afraid to talk about it with you. And here we are. Do you know, like here we are, like having this conversation. And what I want people to know and to remember is that if you start from a place of like love and respect, like this is not again, the whole like why not experts? Like it would be very easy for like an expert to come in and sit, another expert to come in to sit, and they'd never have to see each other. We've got a meeting tomorrow morning with each other. Do you know what I mean? Like we have like all of these things to do together, and so it can be scary. But I am just so proud, like so proud to serve with you. And I think that you are one of the most loving, justice-minded people I've ever met. And so like I invite you all to like take that chance and take that risk and talk about it. Because there's a pretty good chance. Probably not a chance that you're gonna do that conversation up in front of a bunch of people, but like there's a chance.
Just don't have it in front of Erica because she might make you do that.
Seriously, don't have that conversation in front of Erica. But like you might just like fall more in love with the person.
That's what I'm experiencing, right?
Yeah.
That you two are closer than you were before you started this, right? That a divisive issue has brought you closer together, which is one of those great sort of God things. Thank you, Jordan. So Jordan is saying we ought to not assume that we know somebody's whole story just because of a little
bumper sticker.
Yeah, their bumper sticker. Which, by the way, there are people who purposely crash into cars when they have a bumper sticker they don't like. I'm glad you didn't do that, Jordan.
Yes.
All right, so that's what Jordan would like us to come away with. And Tracy?
Oh, I feel like we should end on that note, but one thing I would love for people to take away is the curiosity. And so if someone comes to you and said, I am pregnant and I am not ready for this, I would love for you to, instead of just putting them in the passenger seat of your car and driving them to the Planned Parenthood, ask, how are you feeling? What do you need? What do you want? Is there anyone coercing you into this? What resources are you lacking? Are you aware of these resources that are available? And I know pregnancy centers, especially right now, have gotten a lot of bad press. There are some bad ones, just like there are some bad abortion clinics. But pregnancy centers are places where people can go and get access to resources, diapers, support groups, baby showers even. So just asking the question. They say 4 in 5 women after an abortion didn't really feel like they had all the information they needed. Mm-hmm. So how can we just companion people and be curious and ask about their experience, and not in a judgmental way, not with a preconceived outcome of wanting to steer them in a certain direction, but just to give them a safe place to talk.
Mm-hmm. So Jordan wants us to be curious about the people who have an opinion or a viewpoint about this, and Tracy wants us to be curious about the people who are involved in the experience. So you both want us to be curious, differently and for different reasons. I don't know if you noticed, but these two decided a month ago, a little more, that they were going to do this. And they could have said, okay, we'll show up and share our opinions. But they spent this time soaking themselves in these issues and really praying and deeply going into this conversation in advance, not so they could script and have the right answer, but so they could help, right? So they could talk well in a way that would help us. So I've had you not applaud because we weren't going to do issue and debate. I would love for you to applaud them now. They deserve great. Are you feeling less nervous now?
Yeah, I don't like actually feel like I'm going to throw up
and
anymore.
I also want you to recognize there were no fatalities. We talked about a hard issue and nobody died here, which is good, right? And so we kind of talked about it. It might seem obvious or natural now to break out into small groups and talk, or have some sort of, but we think this is the kind of event and kind of conversation we'd love you to absorb and go home and think about and just pray about. Do what you do when you're open to new things or open to other people. And then Tracy and Jordan and the church want to be a support in this issue. So we imagine if some of you want to have a conversation about this or learn more about it or anything like that, I think Tracy and Jordan have already mentioned that they are glad to put some resources that help them up on the website, and if you would like to access them. But just generally, we think it's a good place to leave it now, to just contemplate and go home with this experience and let it wash over you and do what it does, and let God do what God does. So we won't mill about. I think they're exhausted. We won't mill about and have more questions and things like that tonight. So we're gonna close in prayer tonight. I think I may be missing one other thing. No, I think we're gonna close in prayer, and Jordan's gonna close us in prayer. So let's pray together.
If I could just interrupt first and thank Allen Hilton
Yes,
for being
yes,
here.
yes.
My pleasure.
We're lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let us be in a posture of prayer. God, you are a God of love and justice and mercy and life. And we thank you. We thank you for inviting us into this conversation. We thank you for descending on us with your Spirit. And we ask that as we go out into the evenings, that you would continue to speak through us and in us and help us to discern like what we have learned from this, what we can share with others. And just that everybody knows that Tracy and I are here to talk, and that there are plenty of people who have stories to share. And you have a story to share with us, God. And we ask that you would continue to show us where to go so that we can find the rest of the story. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you all for coming, and God bless you this evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Mary, as well, for doing what you do. I appreciate it. Thank you, folks. Good night.